what's the simplest practical strategy for John to become fat adapted in the shortest time possible without sacrificing the ability to use carbohydrates when performance demands it, such as on race day or on key training sessions?
Yeah, loads of ways to do it, but the quickest way is to...
Matt Carpenter, before we go down the rabbit hole and unpack the science of how to become a highly fat-adapted runner, let's address a fundamental question that I've been having for a long time. Does a recreational runner over 40 need to be on a high-fat or ketogenic diet to be fat-adapted?
Oh, that's a good question. Do they need to be... It depends how we define fat-adapted. That's a really boring answer, but I'll explain it a little bit. And so... if we define fat adapted as using fat as a fuel almost solely, or at that RER of 0.7 that you'd see on like a metabolic car, so using almost fat and nothing else, probably yes. But I think most people's definition of fat adapted as being able to use fat effectively at low intensities, the answer would be no. And we see this a lot with things like ultra runners or just highly trained athletes, where high training volumes will train that fat adaptation to a point that you're very good at burning fat. And in fact, I had this yesterday. I was doing a VO2 max test in our labs with a good athlete, I think a 2:33 marathoner. And we watched him go up the stages, and his RER didn't move for a long time. And so you see, again, that kind of element of fat adaptation. Now, by no means was this person on a ketogenic diet. I suspect quite the opposite. But there's an element of fat adaptation. So I suppose it's all relative to what you're trying to seek, and it's the sort of the levels that you're looking for in terms of fat adaptation. But you can definitely be an effective fat burner without being on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet.
Yeah, it's fantastic that you cleared that up, because there seems to be an assumption, and I see it quite often in the comments of some of my podcast episodes, that being fat adapted means eating a high fat or ketogenic diet. I came to the conclusion that it is not necessary to be on a high-fat diet, because like you said, if you look at the best endurance athletes in the world, your World Tour cyclists, your elite marathoners, your Ironman triathletes, they are consuming huge amount of carbohydrates per hour during training and throughout the day. But if we also look at their fat oxidation rates, they are oxidizing in excess of 1 gram per minute. And, an average weekend warrior like me or you, we're probably at if you're lucky, 0.5 gram per minute of fat oxidation. And, I also remember a very interesting study by George Brooks, and I believe also Inigo San Milan, where they took 3 groups of cyclists. I'm going to butcher the exact details, but what I remember is they had this highly trained cyclists, the recreational cyclists, and sedentary adults. And they got them to cycle on a stationary bike at a similar percentage of their VO2 max. So not the same watts, because, it's going to be all over the place, but similar percentage of their VO2 max. And it was night and day between these 3 groups. Like the sedentary adults, the moment they started pedaling, they almost immediately switched over to almost 100% carbohydrates. But then your elite cyclists that are well-trained, they're cruising along at 80% of VO2 max with very high percentage of fat. So let's double click on that. What does fat adaptation really mean physiologically?
I want to invite you to become one of the founding members of the Endurance Lab Inner Circle. I've created the Inner Circle to give you a way to help shape the conversations I have on this podcast. Before I record with a new guest, I'll let you know who I'm speaking with and what we're planning to explore, so you can send me the questions that you want me to ask. You can also tell me what topics you would like to see explored on future episodes. Now, I'm starting this completely from scratch, so if you're one of the first few people to join, I'll be able to follow your questions and ideas very closely. And while we're still a small group, I'll be in there with you, reading the conversations, replying where I can, and getting to know what you actually want me to explore on the podcast. It's completely free, and we're hosting the Inner Circle on Telegram. So if you'd like to be one of the founding members, you'll find the link in the show notes below. Click the link, tap join, and I'll see you on the inside.
What does fat adaptation really mean physiologically?
Yeah, and so I think you hit the nail on the head there. And really, the way I would look at fat adaptation is the ability to effectively burn fat at low exercise intensities. But really, it's the low intensity bit is where it becomes relative, because for someone that's sedentary, as soon as you start exercising, you're not at low intensity. Any exercise becomes difficult. Whereas someone that's training 12, 15 hours a week, actually most of their training is what they would consider easy. And so, yeah, it's all relative in terms of that fat adaptation, but really it's having the machinery to be able to burn fat. And now in the context of exercise, you would want to be able to do that during exercise. And obviously you'd see that during some kind of progressive exercise test. Is someone able to burn fat at whatever it might be, 50 to 60, 70% of their maximum power output? And very few people are. And, we run a lot of VO2 max tests in our lab, did a lot for my PhD, and you see over and over again, even sometimes pretty well-trained athletes have a surprising inability to be able to burn fat at those lower intensities. And so, the way I would define fat adaptation is just having the machinery to be able to oxidize or burn fat effectively during some kind of exercise, I think, or relative to an intensity. And so, see, that's where training becomes important as well, alongside, in some cases, things like diet as well.
Okay. Does it come down to mitochondrial capacity?
Well, yeah, absolutely, to a point. And so, Of course, if you've got the ability within your mitochondria to maintain aerobic respiration, it's going to prevent increases in lactate. And we know that lactate blocks fat oxidation. So Inigo Samaland, same person, has shown that increases in lactate essentially shut down or close off the CPT1, CPT2 enzymes. And that's what's helping fat get into the mitochondria. And so as soon as you're producing lactate, which again is coming from carbohydrate breakdown, carbohydrate oxidation, particularly the anaerobic side of things, then you're going to receive fat oxidation reduced. And so mitochondrial capacity will have a huge impact on it, which is, I suspect, why trained athletes who may be eating 800-900 grams of carbohydrate a day, in some cases are still very good at burning fat because they've got such effective and efficient mitochondria. So there's definitely an element of that into it.
Okay. So I'm not at all advocating for a high carbohydrate diet here, but like what you just said, someone can be on a high carbohydrate diet and be very highly fat adapted, or being able to oxidize a high level of fat. And that comes down to their training, right?
Yeah, for sure. And again, it's one of those where you see a huge amount of individual variability where people, like I mentioned, there are some people I've tested that are highly trained athletes, ultra runners, in fact, where I sort of often have an assumption of, this person will be good at burning fat because, they run 100 miles like it's nothing type thing, and actually get them in the lab and you think, wow, like they're not that good at burning fat. And then suddenly you start to think about how much better they might be if they were able to, for example, in that case, if training volume is already high, you're not burning much fat. Well, maybe in that case, some kind of periodization or reduction in carbohydrate intake might be a benefit. And so it's not that if you train a lot, you will be good at burning fat, but you do have people that can do that. And I think there's a large level of individual variability there. And that might come down to an extent to diet. It might come down to an extent to training volume. I think there's probably a lot of outside variability to that as well.
Okay. Would you consider fat adaptation a spectrum instead of binary? Like, in other words, a runner can be anywhere along that spectrum at any given time.
Yeah, you've preempted a review that me and myself and one of my colleagues are trying to write right now, and we have been for the last 3 years, which is exactly on this point. When people talk about fat adaptation, same with keto adaptation, they use it as almost like a binary term, like the flick of a switch. Yes, you are fat adapted. No, you're not. And in reality, it's not how metabolism works. And I think it's an uncontroversial point, really, in academia, that there isn't just a yes, you are, no, you're not. And you can see this, like I mentioned, looking at anyone in a lab, you'll see the extremes. When you test someone, you put them on a ketogenic diet, you see that massive shift to almost solely burning fat pretty much straight away. And actually, particularly early on, an inability to burn carbohydrate effectively, at least. And then you see the opposite, where some will start exercising and they're using pretty much solely carbohydrate. And then you see everything in the middle. And that's all really relevant. So, for example, if you've got an ultramarathon runner who's already burning a lot of fat at their race intensity and they're on a fairly high carbohydrate diet, well, then there's already clearly an element there of fat adaptation that's relevant to their sport. And so that may not be the same level of fat adaptation as the person who's not consuming any carbohydrate at all, but it's still fat adaptation to an extent. And I guess it all kind of depends on your definition there. And that's where I try and sort of differentiate slightly between fat adaptation and keto adaptation. With fat adaptation being the ability to burn fat, and then keto adaptation maybe being that slightly more specific idea of being on a low carbohydrate diet and having elevated ketone bodies. So there's definitely levels to it. And I think that's really relevant to performance as well, because again, and this is where there's sort of sex-based differences as well, as females tend to burn more fat than males. And so you may see, for example, particularly in ultramarathon spaces, often very good fat burners without specific dietary interventions. So yeah, it's 100% a spectrum. And yeah, you see that every time you run a VO2 max test, and everyone starts from slightly different rates of fat oxidation in those early stages, particularly.
Okay. You mentioned the ketogenic diet a short while ago. Does someone really need to be in nutritional ketosis if they want to increase their ability to burn fat quickly?
Need to be in ketosis? No. Can it assist? Yes. And so I guess the way I tend to see it is, again, there's lots and lots of ways to increase your ability to burn fat. Many of them come down to dietary manipulations. The most extreme option, or the sort of the quickest way to do it, is to stop eating carbohydrate. And you can see within 5 to 7 days of a ketogenic diet, you can be burning essentially solely fat during exercise. Unfortunately, those same studies that show in 7 days you go from burning carbohydrate to burning solely fat show that your performance falls off a cliff. In those 7 days, people feel terrible. That's just the keto adaptation, sort of keto flu. Yeah, exactly. And so it is a way to do it, but it's not the only way to do it. And that's where things like carbohydrate periodization are becoming more and more popular, or just the sort of dropping carbohydrate without stopping carbohydrate type approaches. And so things like either periodized carbohydrate around training, or just reducing carbohydrate, but not to that sort of ketogenic level. And so there's lots of ways to get better at burning fat. The quickest way to burn fat quickly is through stopping consuming carbohydrate, but that doesn't mean it's the only way.
Yeah. I guess it's also like a spectrum, right? I mean, fat adaptation is a spectrum, and I guess the diet manipulation is also a spectrum. Of course, being in ketosis is one end of the spectrum. Being a high carb athlete is another end of the spectrum, and then you've got that whole range in between. And I asked a question specifically about nutritional ketosis, or being on a fully ketogenic diet, because it's a practical challenge for some people. I've been on a ketogenic diet for about 7-8 months, and my wife's not, my kids are not. So when we have meals together, it's like it practically is not the easiest thing for people. So the reason why I wanted to ask that is because could someone be mostly high fat and occasionally have carbohydrates in their meals and still have that same or close to similar physiological outcome in terms of fat adaptation, right?
If you're using your sports watch or a generic formula to calculate your zone 2, there's a very good chance that you're not training in your true zone 2. And that's not because they are intentionally doing anything wrong. They simply don't know your individual physiology, so they estimate your training zones using population-based formulas. The problem is that if your zone 2 is estimated incorrectly, you can spend months or even years training in the wrong zone without ever realizing it. And that's a much bigger deal than most runners think. Zone 2 isn't an arbitrary heart rate. It's your own individual physiological tipping point where your body reaches its highest rate of fat oxidation before it starts relying heavily on carbohydrates. That point is different for every runner, and it also changes as you get fitter. So no generic formula can tell you exactly where it is. Which means if you're training from estimated zones derived from formulas, there's a good chance you're not training the energy system you think you are. Below your true zone 2, your body adapts to become better at burning fat, building the aerobic base that supports everything from endurance to speed. Drift just above it, and now you're training your body to rely more heavily on carbohydrates instead. That's not a bad thing, but it's a completely different adaptation and not the one you're aiming for. For years, I've used heart rate to measure training intensity, but heart rate is influenced by things like heat, hydration, caffeine, sleep, and fatigue, just to name a few. Then I thought lactate was the gold standard, until I realized that lactate also changes depending on glycogen availability and your nutritional state, making it just as inconsistent as heart rate. That got me thinking that your breathing is one of the closest reflections of what's actually happening metabolically, because it's driven by your body's physiological response and not easily influenced by those external factors. As exercise intensity increases, your muscles gradually shift from burning more fat to burning more carbohydrates, which produces more carbon dioxide that your body has to remove by increasing your breathing. That change in ventilation happens at your own individual physiological thresholds and not at a generic percentage of your maximum heart rate. That's why learning about the VitaPro from Timeware was such a breakthrough for me. Instead of estimating training zones from generic formulas or indirect markers, it measures your breathing in real time to identify your own individual physiological thresholds that are not influenced by external factors. If you're serious about building your aerobic base, improving endurance, and making sure that every zone to run is actually doing what it's supposed to do, I think it's well worth looking into. Timeware is giving listeners of the Endurance Lab podcast $100 off their pro training membership when you use my link in the description with my code ELABTW26. And if you'd like to understand the science behind it all, check out my full conversation with Timeware founder Anar Laursen, also linked in the description below.
Could someone be mostly high fat and occasionally have carbohydrates in their meals and still have that same or close to similar physiological outcome in terms of fat adaptation, right?
Yeah, I'd say the close to similar, I would say for sure. Yeah, and we can't be certain that things will be the same, and it's just not been tested. But I part of my PhD, actually, I interviewed some chronic ketogenic athletes, is sort of what we called them. But we wanted to kind of know kind of exactly what you said there is, how do people stay on this for a long time? Like, what is the motivation? But also, like, how have they done it? And almost to a full, every single individual said, well, actually, I don't get too hung up if I have some carbohydrate here and there. I don't get too hung up if I go to a birthday party and there's no other option, or it would have been rude to not have a meal here because I was in X, Y, Z. And that was a really interesting sort of thing for me to hear, being someone that, so as my PhD was on ketogenic diets, I very much sort of immersed myself in that world. And there was a lot of, I guess, rigidity and the kind of, the sort of almost being scared of carbohydrate and sort of, oh no, stay away from me type approach. And actually these people I spoke to were the opposite, and they were sort of, they were very experimental with carbohydrate. And what I mean by that is, number one, there was a theme of not getting worried if you do have a bit of carbohydrate here or there, just because life. But also then the vast majority of those individuals were at least playing around or experimenting with how to use carbohydrate essentially as an ergogenic aid, as a performance enhancing substance type thing.
Got it. Okay, yeah.
Before exercise, during exercise. And there were exceptions. You spoke to a guy who would run a 100-miler without any carbohydrate. And interesting. And I think it's really, I love hearing stories like this. It shows you what the body is capable of. But the majority of the people there were looking at, okay, how can I use carbohydrates strategically around performance, but also therefore around training to optimize or maximize my performance. And actually the motivations often weren't fully performance based. They were motivated by the feeling and actually the sort of the freedom they have of being on a low carbohydrate diet, and the fact that they enjoyed the way they felt and the way that they could, for example, reduce their fueling needs during long runs and those kind of things. But then using carbohydrate, for example, before a race or before key sessions, to sort of optimize performance alongside that long-term diet. So in terms of, I think that I found that really interesting, because it kind of shows in the real world, what are ketogenic athletes doing? And these were athletes who have been on the diet for at least a year, but in many cases, 3-4 years. And how are they doing it for a long time? And that kind of got me thinking about that question of, okay, does someone need to avoid carbohydrate all the time? And so my first PhD study, we kind of did the opposite of what most studies do. Rather than putting people on ketogenic diets, we got the people already on ketogenic diets and said, here's some carbohydrate. What's going to happen? And we found that obviously acute carbohydrate improved their performance. And so that kind of fit in nicely with what we were hearing ketogenic athletes already doing. A little bit of a tangent, but it kind of also showed us a problem in a lot of research, which doesn't do that. It says, here's 4 weeks, you people eat carbohydrate, you people don't eat carbohydrate. Mm-hmm. And then you go and do whatever performance test they're doing, but they don't add any carbohydrate back in for the group on a low carbohydrate diet. And so you have one group that wake up in the morning and they're given, their banana and their porridge, and the other group that are given, whatever it might be, their bacon fat, and butter. Yeah, exactly. And then they go out, and actually that pre-race carbohydrate might be a confounding variable. And so I would suggest, or my sort of theory based on the data I've seen at least, and then talking to those ketogenic athletes, is that there's definitely a space for, you don't have to be super rigid with not eating carbohydrate. It's always sort of about finding that, I guess, way to balance it within your life, and then potentially using carbohydrates strategically. And I think one of our themes from that research we did, the qualitative research, the interviews, was that there was a lot of experimentation. They were always trying things here and there. Oh, I wonder what will happen if I have some carbohydrate just before this session, after this session, and kind of almost using it as a tool, like you use almost supplements, for example, rather than
like caffeine, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's kind of how I would see that. And those same athletes that we were testing, chronically ketogenic athletes, were burning high amounts of fat. They were presenting with ketones. It wasn't like we were seeing them present differently to people that were completely abstaining from carbohydrate.
Okay. So even in these ketogenic athletes, the occasional ingestion of carbs does not change their level of fat adaptation. Is that correct?
Yeah, not at all.
Okay.
And in fact, when we were giving these athletes carbohydrate in our lab-based study, we were testing ketones at the end of our performance test, which was essentially hour and 30 to hour and 40 minutes of cycling. And even after a 60-gram carbohydrate bolus, or even after 200 grams of carbohydrate for 2 days, plus then 60 grams of carbohydrate, we were still seeing that after exercise, they were showing ketones of at least around 0.5, sometimes a little bit below 0.3, 0.4. But there were still ketones present, and a large part of that is obviously you're exercising, you're performing glycogen depleting exercise. And so that's where the sort of strategic carbohydrate makes a lot of sense. If you're going to have carbohydrate before a session, and that session is hard, glycolytic, well then you're probably going to oxidize that carbohydrate fairly effectively, and therefore you finish the session glycogen depleted, and so you will start producing ketones as you were. And so it's not, there was sort of the old adage, and I think before there was a lot of research in low carbohydrate feeding, there was a talk of if you eat carbohydrate, it's 2 weeks to get back into ketosis, and that was sort of a big thing in the early 2010s. But actually, it's especially for people on sort of longer term ketogenic diets, it's far quicker. In fact, one carbohydrate meal, one hard session, and you're pretty much back where you started. When I was rowing, funnily enough, I was on a ketogenic diet whilst I was rowing competitively, and I would quite often play around with this, and sort of, especially rowing, very intense sport. And so I would sort of see, I wonder, if I eat some carbs here before a particularly horrible session, and I don't like to relive the sessions that you do on rowing machines, but what will happen to my ketones? And the same thing was happening over and over again. Is obviously you consume whatever it might be, carbohydrate drinks or a carbohydrate meal, some rice, whatever it might be. Ketones go down, do the exercise, and you get that. So post-exercise ketosis is a known phenomenon in all athletes. We saw that in the 1980s. It's the first time we started measuring ketones, really. And the same thing happens in people keto adapted. You see ketones come after the session. The difference is they just never go back down, because you sort of, from what I can see, you just go back to that pre-exercise, pre-carbohydrate state.
Could a mechanism of that also be, especially for those that just take the bolus before exercise, that the carbohydrates get used so quickly that it doesn't actually change the ketone levels in the blood? It kind of goes straight to the muscles. It gets oxidized straight away. And it, I don't know, for the lack of a better scientific term, it doesn't stay circulated inside the body.
Yeah, completely. And we were measuring blood glucose across essentially the whole process. And by the end of exercise, there wasn't much of a difference. And you see a bit of a spike in glucose when people do high intensity exercise anyway. But when it comes back down, we weren't seeing huge differences. And so there is that original drop in ketones just in response to a carbohydrate based meal. And so before exercise starts, ketones are lower. But after exercise, you don't see too much difference. And for that exact reason, that's my theory as well, is that you're just using the carbohydrate. And so once you've used it, well, then you will be burning fat again. And particularly the type of exercise we were getting people to do, it was quite high intensity anyway. So they were using carbohydrate as well as fat. And so I suspect what we see is, just rather than using endogenous carbohydrate sources, you're seeing slightly increased carbohydrate use. And that increase comes from just that increased use of exogenous carbohydrate.
Okay. Is there any special or additional adaptations to be had with chronic ketosis versus just occasionally, like, being a ketogenic athlete and then just having some carbs, or, just really staying 100% ketogenic?
That is the $1 million question. So this is where, and sort of kind of the premise of my whole PhD was, we wanted to look at chronic adaptation, because we wanted to kind of know or understand, is there anything happening? And there was an inkling of an idea with the Jeff Volek faster study in 2016. So that came out with the sort of fairly striking result that there was no change in muscle glycogen, or no difference between the groups. And and that kind of got me thinking originally. And so I started my PhD in 2018. So just after that, I was very influenced by that study. And so part of our sort of ponderings, I suppose, was, is there a long-term adaptation that helps spare muscle glycogen so that you have normal levels of muscle glycogen? And maybe that's only an early sign of, so over the 4 to 6 weeks, the typical study length you see depleted muscle glycogen if you stop eating carbohydrate. Makes sense. You're consuming less carbohydrate. Is there something that changes over time? Now, we didn't measure it. We still don't know. Probably not. Looking at subsequent research, that seems to be, the Volek study seems to be an outlier in that sense. There's other schools of thought that there could be changes in the ability to metabolize ketones themselves. And this is saying that the machinery to oxidize ketones seems to take a bit longer than the machinery to oxidize fat. And so we know that we oxidize fat very quickly. You can, like I say, in a week, you can go from oxidizing no fat to oxidizing almost solely fat during steady state exercise. The machinery for ketones seems to be a bit of a longer process. We don't particularly know how long. And the issue there, for want of a better term, is that ketones aren't particularly effective as a fuel in terms of our ability to use them, particularly in the skeletal muscle. Now, it may be different for things like the brain, the heart, which is where actually the interest for me is actually more so looking at the sort of health changes and the use of ketones in that kind of sense, because the muscle doesn't use ketones very much. So there's a lot of papers now that have been able to look at that because of the invention of exogenous ketones and see how good is the muscle at actually using the ketones that we feed it when we give them a load of ketones. The answer is it doesn't use ketones that much. It uses them more at low intensities. But the kind of issue when it comes to exercise is that when we say low intensity, we mean low intensity. The best paper on this so far was by a guy called David Dearlove and his team at Oxford. And they looked at exercise they used the percentage of maximum power output, and they looked at 25%, 50%, and 75% of maximum power output, and how much ketone was someone burning after they took a ketone ester shot. And the highest amount of ketones being used was in the 25% of maximum power output, which, if anyone thinks about sort of the peak power outputs if they're cycling, or high speeds if they're running, and look at a quarter of that, you're looking at walking speed at best. This is, it's not a speed you're ever going to race at or train at.
Or just getting off the couch, getting a drink in the kitchen.
And even that was, the average rate of ketone oxidation was 4.4% of total metabolism. So you're still very much using fat, obviously carbohydrate, in this case they weren't ketogenic athletes, and only a little bit of ketones. And so there's a question as to, are you better at using ketones over time on a low carbohydrate diet? Yes, but it's unlikely because of the way our skeletal muscle is programmed and the gene expression there to use ketones is fairly low. We're never going to be able to run on ketones in terms of it being a dominant fuel source. And so that may be a longer term adaptation. We don't really know. The kind of issue, I suppose, is that at least in the context of exercise, it's probably not going to move the needle. Now, it may, in other contexts, things like I mentioned, the brain is much hungrier for ketones. The heart is much better at using ketones than skeletal muscle. And so there may be contexts, clinical contexts in people with particular sort of pathologies where that becomes useful. But yeah, I scoured PubMed for my whole PhD trying to find something. And yeah, to be frank, there isn't any clear difference. There's some interesting data on longer term keto adaptation from a group in Cape Town, so Jamie Webster's group, who showed no change in gluconeogenesis in longer term adaptation. And so that might be something that's different between your 4 to 6 weeks and your 12 months, which is you're not increasing your rates of the breakdown of amino acids and proteins. So again, that's a sort of another speculation that maybe that's something that over time you're able to hold on to or not lose muscle mass, therefore, so through gluconeogenesis. And again, this kind of, kind of for me comes back a little bit to the fact that there's no one ketogenic diet, and someone on a ketogenic diet could feasibly consume 200, 250 grams of protein a day. They could also, particularly, the historic ketogenic diets were actually quite low in protein. And so kind of an issue you have in all research on ketogenic diets is that what is a ketogenic diet is a really important question. And in every single study, you'll see those macros reported slightly differently. And so long term, are there more changes that happen? I'm sure there are. The the issue we have, I suppose, in physiology is that we put value in things we can measure, and we haven't measured anything that particularly changes. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to a very good question.
No, it's a very good answer. So for the purpose, just for me to rephrase it, so for the purpose of performance and for someone's ability to oxidize fat or to burn fat, right? A full ketogenic diet or the ability to actually oxidize ketone doesn't have any effect on those two purposes. Is that correct?
The ability to oxidize ketones, was that, sorry?
Yeah, the ability to oxidize ketones doesn't really have any meaningful outcomes for the ability to oxidize fat and for performance. It doesn't move the needle for this to.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't seem to. So there was a paper out. It was one of, I think it was Jeff Follett was a co-author on the paper, a fairly recent one, looking at ketone oxidation in people on ketogenic diets, and they basically report ketone oxidation. The ability to use ketones increases when you stop eating carbohydrate, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But it was a very small change, so it still contributed only a minor amount of total metabolism. And so, yeah, in terms of exercise, it's about the fat, not the ketones, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Let's stay on the theme of a ketogenic athlete, right? Let's call this athlete Mary, for example. Say Mary is going on a 3-hour long run, and she, because she wants to be on a ketogenic diet, she is not going to take any gels or any form of carbohydrates because, she's deliberately trying to maintain that strong fat oxidation and not consume any carbohydrates. So if she doesn't want to necessarily train fasted for the 3 hours, apart from water and electrolytes, what could she consume? Basically, what's the middle ground between carbohydrate fueling and doing long sessions completely fasted?
It's a very good question. I mean,
olive oil in a bottle.
Options. I mean, you see all sorts of things. So we, those sorts of things like, well, the high fat alternatives, your snacking cheese and things are feasible. I suppose it always depends on what are you looking to get out of the fuel you're consuming. And so in terms of those sort of high fat alternatives, any high fat food can be consumed on a run. It then just comes down to what are you trying to get out of that consumption of food. So if it's just alleviating hunger, which is a perfectly valid thing to do for ultra marathoning, hunger is an important variable, then that's absolutely fine. But if it's for performance itself, there's probably an argument that there's little benefit to consuming, a couple of blocks of like little cheese type foods or olive oil over just not having anything at all on a 3-hour run. Now that's different if you're going full on 4, 5, 6 hours. But it kind of depends what you're trying to get out of it, I suppose. Now, I know there was, particularly in the early 2000s, you had the sort of the MCT oil craze, which people quite liked. And again, that's doing a fairly similar thing now to exogenous ketone precursors, where it increases ketones slightly. It's probably not going to impact performance, but those sort of high fat, and you can actually get MCT oil in a gel now. So those things are options, and it's, I would always play around with those. You can cause quite bad GI issues and those sorts of things. But they're perfectly feasible to consume. And if nothing else, I find people like it almost as a bit of a comfort. If they're always used to, if I go out for 3 hours, I have gels or I have some kind of fuel, then it's an alternative. So you're still having calories, but not carbohydrate. The alternative on top elsewhere is just low amounts of carbohydrate. And so Tim Noakes' recent work, I think you've had on here, which is awesome.
Yeah, we spoke about that. Yeah,
could listen
the 10 grams.
Yeah, exactly. I could listen to Tim talk all day. But is that sort of just low dose of carbohydrate to maintain blood glucose whilst maintaining your ability to burn fat. And again, that will moderately attenuate or lower fat oxidation. But whilst you're exercising, it's not going to have much of an impact on your fat oxidation, especially if you're on a low carbohydrate diet. That 10 grams an hour, for example, or whatever it might be, 2 gels over a 3-hour period, if that's not going to turn you into, go from lots of fat burning to suddenly you're not burning any fat at all. You're still going to be burning a lot of fat. And so in terms of if people are on low carbohydrate diets, the way I would always suggest is if you're going to have carbohydrate, during the run is a lot more effective than before the run. Before the run, that's when you're going to have your carbohydrate drink, whatever it might be. That's when your insulin spikes. You are going to burn a lot more carbohydrate. And we demonstrated this in our research. And so if you are wanting to keep that fat oxidation high, then small dose of carbohydrate during is always what I would go for if you want actual fuel. If you can do it without, no problems. And then you can use fat alternatives just to, almost as something to eat or something to consume whilst you're going on. But in terms of performance, if it's high fat or nothing, I think there's a decent argument to say, sodium and water done. There's not it's not a need to, you must make sure you've got a high fat gel or a high fat snack on you, although useful to have.
Yeah, I mean, the lens through which I was asking the question is, fasted training after a certain duration can be quite stressful on the body. And I personally have experienced effects on my HRV after doing fasted training day after day after day after day. So so I was just asking in the sense, not to stress your system more than it's already stressed, right? To have some kind of fuel in there. Let's talk a bit about how long does it take for someone to get fat adapted, right? If someone is coming off a high carbohydrate diet. So if someone listening at home right now is thinking, okay, I want to make the change, I want to become highly fat adapted, how quickly can they actually see the change in their ability to oxidize fat?
Yeah, so the change in terms of being able to oxidize fat happens very quickly. And so that happens within 7 days. You tend to start seeing ketones within 3 to 7 days. And so again, that's sort of, people like sort of having that visual of, can I see something's happening? Well, if you're measuring ketones in some way, whether that be through urine strips or through a finger prick sample, you can start to see that typically within around 3-4 days. Fat oxidation is as high as it will ever be within about a week. But like we mentioned earlier, that doesn't correlate linearly with performance. And so performance in those first 1 to 2 weeks tends to go through the floor. And again, in my interviews with ketogenic athletes, this was coming back over and over again, was, how difficult it was to get through the first few weeks. And you got a bit of a range, actually. You had some athletes mention that they didn't really notice any difference. They didn't particularly feel a thing. And you had some athletes say that every single run felt like they were running through mud until, until weeks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., etc. So you've got a huge range of experiences. And I'm sure there's things that we could look at in future that sort of, what is a predictor of how well someone will adapt? It may well be their sort of prior ability to use fat. It may be the sort of the diet they were on before, those sorts of things. But irrespective of that, you can start burning fat very quickly. I guess the challenge is, how long does it take for performance to return to baseline? And again, there's always going to be that individual variability there. But most research tends to show 4 to 6 weeks is a time where you'll see no difference in performance from pre to post. And so fat oxidation very quickly, that sort of performance return tends to be that 4 to 6 week mark.
Okay. And you're saying just now that the maximum fat oxidation someone is going to see is going to happen after about 7 days. Is that correct? And it's not going to go higher?
Pretty much, yeah. And so it might change slightly, but we see, and I think it's actually Louise Burke work that's shown this, is that just within 7 days, you can go from pretty much burning no fat at all to burning pretty much solely fat. And so ratio-wise, yes. Now, one thing that may change over time is being able to go at higher intensities and still be burning fat.
Yeah.
And so, for example, Jeff Volek's work, the 3-hour runs they were doing were at 65% VO2 max. So at decent intensity, and they were still burning huge amounts of fat. And so that might change, but your machinery that is using fat, that's pretty much an instant change. But yeah, it's not necessarily in terms of like a percentage of fat use in that 1 week mark, that won't change from there. But total quantity of fat, as you said, that may change.
Okay. So as the athlete gets fitter, mitochondria develops more, that absolute amount per minute or per hour that they're oxidizing is going to increase, but the percentage kind of hits the ceiling after 1 week.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. And part of that could also be the sort of the down regulation you see in the ability to use carbohydrate. That might, again, this is speculative because we don't really know. All the studies on this have been 1 week long, so you can't really extrapolate. We can do is speculate, but part of that might be that over time, and again, this will depend on training, but it might be after that 1 week that your carbohydrate use is as flawed as it will ever be. And so there may be an element of actually getting better at using the endogenous carbohydrate over time. So for example, particularly people that continue to do high intensity work, which is glycolytic, even if you're on a low carbohydrate diet, you may be able to build machinery to use carbohydrate more effectively. So part of that massive increase in fat oxidation after a week may not just be the built machinery to use fat, it might be the sort of the destruction of machinery to use carbohydrate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Over time, over a long period of time, how much of fat oxidation comes from a change in diet versus purely the adaptations from endurance training?
So diet will do the job more quickly, but that's where quantity becomes important, because you sort of, if I was to take an untrained athlete and a sedentary individual, put them on a ketogenic diet, they would be burning relatively lots of fat. So 100% fat, 0% carbohydrate during low intensity exercise, but the total volume of fat per minute still wouldn't be that high, just simply because they aren't able to exercise at, say, an intensity that elicits 800 calories a minute worth of 800 calories an hour, worth of energy expenditure. And so, if you look at your elite marathoners, they're exercising at 1,200 calories an hour worth of ATP they're generating. And so, obviously, the better trained you are, the higher output you're working at, the higher VO2, more calories you're consuming. Obviously, that calorie expenditure has got to come from somewhere. And so, if we're looking at, say, two athletes, one of them's running a 60-minute 10K, one's running a 30-minute 10K, well, that 60-minute 10K, maybe you're going at 700 calories an hour. So that could be 700 calories an hour all from fat. It's a lot, but that person running the 30-minute 10K, well, they're running at 1,200 calories an hour. That fat burning per minute is substantially higher. And so they kind of work in tandem in a way where you give yourself the ability to burn fat by changing your diet. You give yourself the ability to, I guess, maximize your ability to burn fat, but you won't be able to hit those huge quantities without training. And so you see the highest numbers we see in literature from Louise Burke, from Jeff Volek, tend to top out at just below 2 grams a minute. And you would never get someone that's sedentary using that much energy really at all, because they just don't have the machinery. And so, they work in tandem really. And so, and someone, before we looked at the ketogenic diet literature, the sort of consensus was that maximum fat oxidation was 0.5 to 0.7 grams an hour in sort of non-ketogenic individuals. And so that's still a pretty large quantity of fat when you think about it. But then that can change 2.5 fold when you change diet. So they're both massively increasing your ability to use fat. I guess one's doing it relatively, which is the diet, and one's doing it absolutely, which is that increased fitness.
Yeah. And I'm guessing for someone that is just a recreational athlete training 5-6 hours a week, diet would help a lot more, right? They don't have the luxury of training 15 hours, 20 hours a week at low intensity to really ramp up that aerobic capacity to burn fat. So that change in diet is going to take them across the spasm a lot faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's always multiple ways to achieve similar outcomes. And that's where things like fasted training or periodized carbohydrate ingestion can be quite useful, because one of the sort of theories as to why elite athletes are so good in some cases at burning fat is that because they're training so much, they are starting a lot of their exercise glycogen depleted, even though they're consuming huge amounts of carbohydrate. If they're training 2 sessions a day, sometimes more if you add in S&C and all those kind of things, regardless of the food they're consuming, there will be some sessions where their glycogen stores in the muscle and the liver are low or moderate, and it's often quite rare that they're exercising with high muscle glycogen, high liver glycogen. And so you can do that on 5 to 6 hours a week by periodizing carbohydrate, by having, by training and then having a low carbohydrate meal and then waking up the next morning and training again. You're building that machinery to burn fat through sort of manipulations in your diet that elite athletes might not need to do because they're training so much. And so things like periodized carbohydrate use and fasted training is also effective ways, never as effective. And that's where you get that spectrum. If you wanted to just burn fat, stop eating carbohydrate, it happens in a week. But that's a big step for some people. Like you mentioned, it's a difficult thing to fit in often with just other life events. And especially the world of endurance is so carbohydrate dominated. It's sort of so carbohydrate obsessed that sometimes it can be hard to, I spoke to quite a lot of cyclists who the thing they found hard was that all their social rides end up going to a cafe where everyone gets coffee and a cake. And so actually, one of the hard bits was sort of, I feel like a bit of an outcast because everyone's getting cake and I'm just having my coffee. So it's that kind of, there's other methods you can use to increase fat oxidation to an extent, without dropping carbohydrate completely. Again, it's all relative. You're not going to build that same level of fat oxidation machinery, but you'll build some. And I think for a lot of people, some is better than none. And a lot of
let's touch on fat adaptation versus metabolic flexibility. So someone on a keto diet may be exceptionally good at using fat for energy. That said, if metabolic flexibility means the ability to use large amount of fats when appropriate and rapidly switch to, say, carbohydrates or glycogen oxidation when the demand calls for it, could someone become extremely fat adapted while actually becoming less metabolically flexible?
Yes. And I've seen this in the lab. And so and I saw a real range of it, actually. So we had some interesting, my PhD supervisor was one of these, who he stopped eating carbohydrate and his fat oxidation went up through the roof, as you'd expect. But in a progressive exercise test, he couldn't get his respiratory exchange ratio above 1, which would indicate essentially a very low ability to use carbohydrate, and so an inability to essentially respire anaerobically, so to go through those real high intensity things. So we tend to see, for context, in a VO2 max test, you see a top out of RAR at about 1.15, and that's when you know someone's legs are on fire because of that anaerobic glycolysis component, the acidity building up in the muscles and all those kind of things. In his case, and he wasn't the only one that we saw, he just doesn't get up to that top end. Now, the alternative, which was more common, to be honest, was that most athletes I was testing that were ketogenic presented normally, at least metabolically, at that top end. Now, a lot of data suggests that that top end can be an issue for people on low carbohydrate diets. And so I know there's some data suggesting, it was David Shaw, I think, that they looked at these progressive exercise tests and showed that essentially they got one stage less far on a ketogenic diet. And so they weren't able to reach that top end of power output. But when we looked at specifically the metabolism, most athletes were still at least demonstrating that metabolic flexibility. Now, how their performance is impacted throughout that kind of curve is, we didn't look at particularly, but the consensus seems to be that at that top end, there is some kind of attenuation through reduced glycolysis, essentially a reduced rate of glycolysis. But there are the extremes. And again, I saw a couple where you almost, you're able to burn fat for real, but you are essentially unable to do that hard stuff. And again, that's kind of where it comes down to what is someone's sport. If you're an ultra marathon runner, in most cases, actually, you probably would never notice that top end bit. Whereas obviously if you're training for a 5K, 10K and you're doing hard repeats, that's when you do notice it. The kind of other school of thought there may be that also training is impacting it itself. If you're fat adapted and then you're just doing, your sort of classic zone 2 type long, slow training, well, actually, maybe you're losing or you're sort of reducing your ability to use carbohydrate and you're never training it back up with glycolytic exercise. So it may be sort of that relationship between diet and training. And so someone that is continuing on maintaining some harder work will maintain the ability to use carbohydrate, whereas someone that's not will lose it. And that's been demonstrated in rodents, but not in humans, as far as I'm aware. Is so a reduction in the GLUT4 receptor from someone on a low carbohydrate diet. But again, in rodents, but interesting nonetheless, was a study looking at a ketogenic diet compared to a ketogenic diet alongside high intensity exercise, where the high intensity exercise maintained the GLUT4 receptor. And so that kind of leads me to the hypothesis that if someone is going to drop carbohydrate, even if they're running ultramarathons sport, there's a case for still building in some intensity somewhere to train that machinery as you would if you were doing sort of shorter, more intense type exercise.
Yeah, you lose the specificity of those fast sessions, right? I mean, if you're a runner, you lose the ability to run fast and you just get stuck in that range of running slow all the time. In a perfect world, what would true metabolic flexibility look like for a masters endurance athlete? How would they maximize both sides of the equation?
The way I see things is, there's no sort of I don't particularly like ascribe to the idea of there's a perfect diet or there's a perfect this or that, but there's sort of key principles that you'd always look at. And for me, one key principle is always going to be some level of periodization or strategy around nutrition, whether that be the periodization of carbohydrate, whether that be the periodization of fasted training, whether that be the periodization of low carbohydrate times to maximize your ability to use fat where appropriate, alongside potentially, say, the periodization of carbohydrate for key sessions to maximize. If you're doing, say, a track session, for example, that might be the time to use carbohydrate to really maximize intensity, and that's going to be maximizing your ability to use that top end anaerobic glycolytic system. And so it always depends on sort of the athlete and sort of where you start, I suppose. For example, the vast majority of the population, they haven't got a problem using carbohydrate, and that sort of PDK4 is doing its thing already. And so for most people, it's okay if you build in a level of periodization, whether that be a few fasted sessions, whether that be even Josh Kerr, I heard, spoke recently about he's built in a 16-hour fast like once a week into his week. And even those sorts of things, which, for an athlete who is not very good at using fat, is a simple way of, okay, I now do a fast 1 day a week, which is 16 hours. And it's going to mean that you've got at least one session a week where you're training that fat adaptation machinery. And so that's definitely one part of how you go about building metabolic flexibility. I guess it always depends on where you start. Most people start being fine at burning carbohydrate because we're all sort of bored up in terms of diet. Very few people lose that ability. So fat is the bit you focus on. Now, the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, is someone that is fat adapted. And then I think it comes down to two sort of options. You've got two things I would do in conjunction, really, which is strategic carbohydrate feeding. And then that strategic carbohydrate feeding coming around key sessions, which would be hard sessions or long sessions. The hard sessions will be the ones to maximize your ability to use carbohydrate. But you still want to be able to use the carbohydrate you're ingesting. And that's where things like, and this is where I think Tim Noakes' 10 grams an hour stuff has been really interesting. That ability to continue using or consuming carbohydrate definitely has its place there to be able to use carbohydrate effectively. So I think it always depends on where you start. For most people, it's how can you build better fat oxidation, fasted training, periodizing, things like that. For the ketogenic sort of type athlete, maybe that's building in some intensity somewhere, and you can do that without using any carbohydrate. There is, if someone says, right, I really don't want to touch carbohydrate, maybe it's, maybe someone's diabetic and they're doing it for health reasons, but they're also training. Then actually just building in one high intensity session per week, 1K repeats, maybe go to a track, whatever it might be. Well, that's going to help you oxidize more carbohydrate, and through that process, you will, to an extent, upregulate the enzymes involved in using carbohydrate. And so that's definitely got a place, I think, especially in sort of ultra running, where a lot of people fall into the same sort of training program of everything is long and slow. And so that's definitely something that people can add in to build up that top end, I guess, ability, which again gives you that beautiful curve on a max test where you're burning loads of fat at low intensities, but at those top intensities, you're right up there, demolishing and creating that lovely acidity that we all know too well in the muscles.
So I guess you're saying that even though somebody wants to become very highly fat adapted, you don't want to lose that adaptation to oxidize carbohydrates at the high end.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's all relative to the point where an ultra marathon runner might feasibly say to me, well, why should I care about my top end? And it's a fair point in the sense that if you're running a flat ultra marathon, if they exist, run on the River Thames down here in the UK, then you probably aren't going to see much of a difference with not having a top end as such. Saying that,
but I would argue that if you have the top end, that trickles down to how fast you can run at a slow pace. I don't know whether you know who Alexander Sorokin is. With the absurd Stravas that I scroll through sometimes, where he's running like 3 minutes, 15 I just had a conversation with him yesterday. So and he's saying that he's 44 now and he's losing his top end speed, and that trickles down to how fast he can run 100K or 100 miles or even his 24-hour runs. So he's prioritizing fast sessions now, right? His 10 times 1K or 6 times 2K to try and maintain that speed as he gets a bit older, and that kind of trickles down to how fast you can run for, I don't know, 6 hours. So yeah, I think that makes a lot.
Yeah, it does make complete sense. And actually, it's the same training principles you see for shorter events, I suppose. And maybe that's kind of ultra running, almost in a way catching up with the training principles you see in 5Ks, 10Ks, halves, and your marathons, where people train above marathon intensity before they run their marathons. And so,
correct,
it is no difference to that fundamentally, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about the concept of train low, race high. I know we've touched on this earlier, but specifically the studies that you did around this. So can you walk us through your findings and the practical strategy to introduce carbohydrates at the right time for someone that is on a predominantly high-fat diet to improve performance? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So our research, we brought in a group of chronically ketogenic athletes. We defined that as been on the diet for at least a year. And we gave them carbohydrate in 2 different modes, essentially, or actually 3 different modes. But we gave them either 2 days worth of carbohydrates. So we called it a carbohydrate feed rather than like a carb load. But the idea was to mimic a sort of carb load that people would do before a race, but keep them blinded to whether they were consuming carbohydrate, which challenge in itself. And so what we did there was give them 200 grams of carbohydrate a day for 2 days leading up to a time trial on the bike. And then we also provided a 60-gram carbohydrate just half an hour before exercise. But we created the conditions in which we sort of mixed up who got what and when they got it. And so what we ended up with was a placebo group that got nothing at all, then a group that just had those 2 days of carbohydrate for 200 grams a day, but nothing in the morning. So they came in fasted still, but they'd had their 200 grams a day before. Then we had a group that came in with their 200 grams a day and then had the added 60 grams right before exercise. And then finally, the final group was just 60 grams and no 200 grams a day before. And so you kind of
4 groups in total.
Exactly. And it was all about, actually, it was partly inspired by Zach Bitter talking about how he used to use carbohydrate. And so we always wanted the idea of manipulating, essentially doing what we do to manipulate muscle versus liver glycogen. And so we've got the 200 grams a day to hopefully increase muscle glycogen stores in the build up to their race. The 60 grams is going to increase blood glucose right before and hopefully help maintain liver glycogen. And so then we wanted to just add them together to see if there was any sort of synergistic effect. Would the 200 grams a day help upregulate the enzymes involved in using carbohydrates so you could better use the carbohydrate on race day type thing? And we found that essentially that 200 grams a day for 2 days wasn't really doing much. And so the 60 grams right before exercise improved performance. It improved performance in both the condition where they'd already had 200 grams and when they had had nothing. And so there was no difference, and this is all repeated measures, so same participants do each test for us. There was no difference between having your 60 grams of carbohydrate following no carbohydrate in the days before, so you stayed ketogenic and then just had your 60 grams. That didn't perform any differently in performance or metabolism to the group that had 200 grams a day and then had your 60 grams, which actually was a surprise to me. I was expecting essentially better carbohydrate oxidation in the group that had 200 grams a day before, because the sort of concept is they'll come in with slightly higher glycogen levels and slightly increased enzymatic activity of the carbohydrate related enzymes. And so they're sort of almost more receptive to the carbohydrate. We actually found that there was no difference. And again, this is all relative to the fact that we didn't measure glycogen stores. So was 200 grams a day enough to increase muscle glycogen? How big was that difference? We don't know. But the sort of big takeaway for us there was actually people on low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets can be quite precise about when they consume or use their carbohydrate. You don't need a big carbohydrate load. So what we saw with that 200 grams a day for 2 days is essentially it did increase carbohydrate oxidation slightly, but there was no actual significant difference in carbohydrate oxidation and performance in that 200 gram a day group compared to placebo when they weren't having the 60 grams before exercise. So just having 2 days of carbs before and then turning up fasted didn't improve performance compared to staying ketogenic, which is really interesting because, again, this is where, and it came out, that paper, at a very similar time to Noakes and Prinz's work, looking at muscle, liver glycogen, and the relative importance of the two. And it sort of fit that story really nicely in the sense that that manipulation of blood glucose and liver glycogen to help maintain blood glucose during exercise, which you get from the acute dose of 60 grams, was having a much more marked effect on performance than having that carbohydrate in the 2 days before. And so
that's a small
sort of
pool, right? We're talking about
exactly
now. Yeah.
yeah.
If we
So
relate it to Noakes' study.
Exactly, yeah. So manipulating the small pool with the pre-exercise carbohydrate, that was improving performance. Manipulating or attempting to manipulate the large pool didn't seem to impact performance at all. Which was really interesting in itself, but also almost makes life, I guess, a bit easier almost for ketogenic athletes, because the way I would interpret that study, and again, we've got to be sort of careful in terms of generalizing outside of the way we tested. So we were using a 16-kilometer cycling time trial, so it's about a half-hour-ish time trial, after a 60-minute steady-state cycle. So about an hour and a half of total exercise, and only a half an hour test. And so, when you're looking at training for, your 100-mile race, it's a different modality. We can't be sure it translates and all those caveats. But saying that, the data we got would suggest that the time to focus on carbohydrate is in and around exercise itself rather than in the build-up. And now sort of go beyond that. And if I was to run our study again, I would look at intra-race carbohydrate rather than pre-race. And I'm quite interested on sort of the difference between those two. And if I was working with an athlete on a low-carb diet, I would focus on the in-race rather than the pre-race for the reasons I described before, as it will help you better maintain fat oxidation throughout. It will prevent that sort of pre-exercise insulin spike, which will get you burning a lot more carbohydrate originally. And so rather than doing what we did in our study and giving 60 grams before, I think something like the 10 grams an hour type strategy, or like minimal carbs, like sipping carbs over the course of your race, is a better option. You could do both. But in terms of maintaining liver glycogen, it doesn't take much, and you'd much rather do it with small amounts of carbohydrate in a race rather than one big bolus before. Because then what we saw was obviously blood glucose goes up and it just comes down more slowly. And so it slowed down or attenuated blood glucose, but likely not as effective as just sort of continuous small amounts of carbohydrate throughout a race.
Okay, yeah, actually that was my next question is, if someone is going to take that 60-gram bolus before the start of the race for a longer race, such as a marathon or an ultra, would they be topping up carbohydrates throughout the race for the ketogenic athlete to continue to maintain a performance, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's the way I would go. And again, that's sort of where the way when we were looking at it from a research perspective, it was sort of how do we best sort of control these conditions? And that's where the 60-gram single bolus became sort of essentially the most practical way for us to test, especially because for us, we had our very grateful for them, our poor participants, wearing their indirect calorimetry mask for the whole 90 minutes and suddenly getting into the logistics of taking on all those kind of things. Yeah. We went for let's just do it pre-exercise. And one thing I'd love to do actually is compare the pre versus just continuously in. But thinking about it sort of, I guess, logically, I would always go for that in race being more effective in terms of keeping or maintaining liver glycogen. Obviously, the longer the event gets, the clearer that becomes. If you're running a 5K, it's not particularly important.
Yeah.
But once you start to get, to your hour and a half, 2 hours beyond, well, if we're looking at this from a liver glycogen and blood glucose perspective, one bolus at the start is going to help reduce somewhat blood glucose decline, but you are still risking hypoglycemia towards the end of exercise anyway. And that's when it would happen anyway. And so it's definitely a more efficient way to do it, to just consume carbohydrate throughout in small boluses. And sorry, I say just to caveat that as well, when I say consume throughout in small boluses, that can, I guess, in a way sound quite difficult because, there's no such thing as a 10-gram carbohydrate gel. So what is someone actually going to have? The alternative there is if you're doing a 2-hour race, a gel at 60 minutes, that'll do your job, And even maybe that means, a small amount of carbohydrate before you start, and then you top up at an hour. It doesn't mean you need to be sort of, if you're running for 3 hours, you have to have 10 grams an hour precisely, like in 3 doses. Having, just spreading carbohydrate out will help obviously over a long period of time. But it's all relative to the exercise you're doing. You're having 1 30-gram gel, or say, 2 20-gram gels, for example, in a 4-hour race. That's probably going to do the job there rather than having to split it up. There are gels now you can get that you can screw back on, which is really convenient for these kind of things, to be fair. Like Precision Fuel and Hydration got their 90-gram gels, which you can unscrew and screw on, which for that kind of...
It's 300 grams. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so those sort of things are really convenient for this kind of thing, because otherwise, trying to run around with half a consumed 30-gram gel, just difficult.
Once you tear it, Yeah, it's done and dusted.
You don't want
right?
to be putting that back in your pocket. But,
Not at all.
but yeah, so it's not. Yeah, I would always, again, as always, you try something in training before you do it in races, and so you start to get a feel for these things. But I think we're not in a place in terms of the data we've got now to be overly prescriptive in terms of you must consume this amount at these given times. It's kind of having a play around, but knowing some carbohydrate throughout is going to help reduce or slow down that drop in blood glucose and maintain your blood glucose. And that's a key part of performance.
For your study in particular, the 200 grams the 2 days before that you were giving the participants, what form of carbohydrates were they in? And the 60 grams before the test, was it a gel, or how did you administer those carbohydrates?
So it was as part of a drink, and we kept this really simple. And so it was dextrose. So simple dextrose, 60 grams before, and then the drink was 200 grams of dextrose with cruel. So it's fast-acting carbohydrate. With the idea, with that 200 grams, that they're sipping it throughout the day. And so we, in the strongest terms possible, said, please don't down this drink. Ketogenic athlete, suddenly you've got 200 grams of carbohydrate. And so that was sort of the drink to sip throughout the day. And again, that was purely as a way of maintaining consistency. And if we're to do it again, if we wanted to make it sort of more, I suppose, sort of practically relevant, you'd maybe want some kind of starchy carbohydrate, but we wanted to basically maximize the chance of them not knowing what they were having, which when you're giving a lot of carbohydrate can be difficult. And also just reducing the number of variables. And so, we used the same type of carbohydrate, which was dextrose. Amazingly, taste-wise, made no difference adding that to the drink, which in itself I found quite revelationary, especially I started my PhD when I was 23, maybe 22, 23. And you taste the drink. I was getting all my fellow PhD students to sort of taste the placebo versus the carbohydrate to see if anyone could taste the difference, thinking, how on earth can we hide all this carbohydrate? And so we used like squash, so like a cordial type thing, sugar-free cordial, added in a bit of stevia, and then adding on the carbohydrate made no difference to the taste. And so suddenly I was like, right, okay, well, why on earth is carbohydrate getting added into all these sugary drinks in that case? Because the taste was completely identical, which was useful for us. But yeah, so that's how we did it. Yeah, it was all dextrose.
I still have a couple of questions, but I think we're coming close to the 90 minutes. How's your time? Are you okay to go for 10 extra minutes?
Yeah, not a problem at all.
Okay, fantastic. The next question is something I've been trying to have answered. So let's take two equally talented and equally well-trained runners or athletes, right? One follows a conventional high carbohydrate diet. The other is on a high fat, highly fat adapted. I said high fat diet and highly fat adapted, and then strategically introduces carbohydrates for races and key training sessions. Assuming all else is equal, who wins?
Oh, well, it's unanswerable, and I'm such a boring academic sometimes. I'll give you my sort of theory is I think the longer the exercise test is, so the longer the race is, the more chance that keto adapted athlete, the bigger advantage that keto adapted athlete has. And I always come back to when I was a student, my physiology lecturer put up 2 Google Maps sheets for us in our second year of university when she was giving us this session. And she said, right, we're in Southwest London. And she showed us a Google Map image that was Southwest London to sort of North London. And so that's how far you can run on carbohydrate. And then the second map was a map from Southwest London, from our location, all the way to somewhere in Italy. And she said, that's how far you can run solely on fat. And so when you start to think of things in that lens, once you start to get into your ultra distances, the keto adapted athlete has an advantage in 2 ways. One is a reduced need for carbohydrate ingestion. And we know that particularly in ultra endurance, gastrointestinal issues are so common. And if you can reduce your chance of gastrointestinal distress through reducing your need for carbohydrates, so maybe that's consuming 40 grams an hour rather than 60 grams an hour, or
120 these days.
So now you're seeing rates up here, and coincidentally, gastrointestinal issues also up here. But if you can reduce your need for carbohydrate, well, over time, if that's reducing the chance of GI distress, that's an advantage. And on top of that, we know that although carbohydrate does play a role in sparing muscle glycogen, it doesn't play a particularly big role in it. And so the most effective thing you can do to spare muscle glycogen is to be better at burning fat. And so once you get to those, really long type of events we're talking, so 10 hours plus, actually muscle glycogen depletion is essentially inevitable. And so who do you put your money on 12 hours into an event? All else equal, I put my money on the person keto adapted. In the shorter stuff,
What about a 2-hour marathoner like Sebastian Sawe?
Yeah, so there I'll put my money on the carbohydrate adapted athlete, and the reason is this, and I think this is where elite athletes are very different to non-elite athletes. But Louise Burke's work on this has been really informative, looking at the elite race walkers they look at the impact of ketogenic diets. And although their interventions are fairly short, they're unbelievably well controlled. They give them every single meal. It's an amazing sort of series of research, but their research all comes down to exercise economy and how efficient is the athlete. And at those, my sort of premise is that, so they show repeatedly that elite race walkers after 3 weeks-ish of ketogenic feeding get slower, and they link that directly to the improved efficiency of carbohydrate oxidation. And my sort of take on this, based on that alongside all the other research we've got, which is in non-elite athletes, is that the small difference in efficiency between burning fat and carbohydrate is almost definitely negligible for most athletes. It's not going to be enough to move the needle on performance. But at that elite end, where you're looking at those sort of tiny percentages, that is where, based on that work, that may be something that's a relevant factor, is that reduced oxygen cost of carbohydrate over fat, particularly since, your Sebastian Sawes of the world, they'll be running a marathon at 90% of VO2 max most likely. And so things that move the needle just slightly will have a difference. And so when you're putting intensity high, that's when my money goes on, at the elite end at least, my money goes on the carbohydrate adapted athlete. If you give me those two same athletes, but they're, say, 3-hour marathon runners, then I'm saying it's a flip of a coin.
But at
I'm
the
on
elite
age. But I'd say, the longer exercise gets and the less intense exercise gets, that's where my money moves towards the keto adapted athlete. The short / more intense exercise gets, that's where you lean towards carbohydrate adapted, I would suggest.
Okay, so I'm guessing based on what you said, it's not so much the distance, but how much of VO2 max they're actually performing, right? Like an elite marathoner, like you said, is 90% VO2 max. Somebody is running a 6-hour marathon might be running it at 65% of VO2 max, for example. And
the average marathons run at 65% VO2 max. And so we think about that's also that intensity just happens to correspond with your maximal fat oxidation most of the time. And so actually, as a rule, typically, if your average person running a marathon, that fat oxidative capacity is super important. But for Sebastian Sawe,
that makes so much sense. Makes so much sense. Yeah. A podcast conversation dedicated to fat adaptation would not be complete without touching on fasted training. So based on your studies and based on all the published literature that you have come across, does fasted training actually make sense? And if it does, how often, how long?
So again, these things always come down to sort of what athlete you're working with, what adaptation are you trying to induce. The beauty of people on low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets is that you never have to worry about a fasted training session, because firstly, people tend to train fasted anyway. There's almost like a natural synergy between the two. But also, even if you have a high fat meal before exercise, you're still mimicking fasted training in the sense that you're training to maximize your fat oxidative capacity. Fasted training is actually, in its research sort of support, is fairly limited. I think that's more a consequence of how hard it is to do research in that kind of space and the differences you're looking at, rather than fasted training itself. So my take on fasted training is that for most people on mixed diets or non-ketogenic diets, I almost always sort of try and suggest fasted training, because again, the amount of people we see in the lab that have very limited fat oxidative capacity, it's a really easy way to build some capacity. I quite often hear people, good athletes, say, I can't get out for my morning run unless I've had a banana or a bagel or something. And to me, that screams of, I'm not very good at burning fat. You wake up, your liver glycogen depleted. If you're not able to just get out and do an easy run, well, that kind of suggests maybe you're not great at burning fat. And so purely on a physiological level, there's a clear case for fasted training to build that capacity to oxidize fat more effectively. In terms of how often or how regularly should someone do it, on people on that kind of person I've just described, I would always say before an easy session, once a week is a great way to start, and that's not going to do you any harm. That's you might see limited benefits, but it's something to start with. And again, that's where you sort of come back to what is the athlete, what's their training load. Someone training a lot will be training glycogen depleted almost inevitably, and so you have almost less need to build in a fasted session. Someone that's training 5 hours a week, just running in the evenings, for example, Monday to Friday, and doing their long run on a Sunday, well, that sort of person, actually then you might have to consciously add in, okay, maybe Tuesday's our day where we stay low carb during the day. And so rather than a purely fasted session, it's a low carbohydrate session where you're getting similar benefits. But the caveat that I will always apply to this is that there's limited research support, to be transparent, for fasted training interventions as a means of enhancing performance. But we know that fasted training will support fat oxidation, and fat oxidation is a huge part of exercise, particularly long exercise. So when you get beyond half marathon distance for most people, fat oxidation becomes particularly important. Most people aren't very good at burning fat. And also, I think from a health perspective, it's definitely not a bad thing to be good at burning fat. I think it's a good argument to say it's a very good thing. And so I do think you can maybe go too far and start trying to run every session fasted, and that's where that kind of strategy comes in. But I think it's a really easy tool to implement before easy sessions. And then you can kind of take it from there. And then can you build in a second session a week where you train fasted? If so, give it a go. And that's where you can kind of almost create your week of how things look. And this is where also things like lab testing can help. If someone's already very good at burning fat, well, actually, you probably don't need to prioritize changing anything in that sort of sense. Like I said, most people aren't. And so you do.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's summarize and make everything we talked about practical for someone listening at home. Say John is a 50-year-old recreational runner with a full-time job, a wife, and 2 kids, training, like you said, 5 to 7 hours a week across 4 to 5 runs. What's the simplest practical strategy for John to become fat adapted in the shortest time possible without sacrificing the ability to use carbohydrates when performance demands it, such as on race day or on key training sessions?
Yeah, loads of ways to do it, but the quickest way is to drop carbohydrate where you can. And that's where dropping carbohydrate doesn't have to mean stopping carbohydrate. I think that's a really big takeaway. And I say this as someone who's researched ketogenic diets, which is that extreme of stopping carbohydrate, but it doesn't mean you have to. And that might mean a day a week that is low carbohydrate, maybe a day you can control for whatever reason that might be. It might be that you keep certain meals low carbohydrate. And so I know for a lot of people, dinner's the hard meal, because dinner is where you're sitting with your family. You might have made dinner for everyone, and you've got carbohydrate right there. And so for one person, that might be your breakfast and your lunch. You keep the carbohydrates low, and that means your total daily carbohydrate is lower, and you're going to see a shift in fat metabolism from that, even if you're consuming carbohydrate at dinner. And it could be, like I say, it could be the weekends you keep low carbohydrate because that's when you're able to. It might be the opposite. It might be during the week. But interventions to manipulate carbohydrate availability, I think, are useful. And there's lots of ways you can do that, either during the week or during the day. Once you do that, you can then start to fit training around it. See, okay, this is the time of the day or the time of the week that my carbohydrate is low. And that's therefore the session I can use to specifically support fat oxidation. So whether it's, I know that, on a Thursday morning, I start work at 10 o'clock, I drop the kids at nursery at 8 o'clock, and I've got a window. Well, then it might be that the Wednesday night is the night that you consume less carbohydrate. You wake up the Wednesday morning, you stay fasted, or you consume just a small low carbohydrate breakfast, and then you've got your fasted run built in. So I guess it's that there are small things you can do that make a difference, and it doesn't have to be a complete change of lifestyle to make that change.
I love that your approach, or at least the work that you do and all this research that you do, is not very dogmatic in the sense of it's not in one camp of it's high fat or it's high carb. It's, at least what I get it from the time that we spent talking, is that yours is kind of like a hybrid approach, right? Where you pull the best of both worlds for the purpose. Fantastic. As we start to land the plane here, is there anything that we should have talked about regarding fat adaptation and carbohydrates that relate to your work that we have not discussed?
I think we've covered a good amount. I think I really appreciate the sort of what you've just outlined there, because that's really my key takeaway from both my research, but also, I guess, my own life. So when I started my PhD, I did that. I went very hardcore ketogenic alongside pretty intense, rowing, training 12 sessions a week type thing. And actually, I quite enjoyed it. My performance was pretty good. I started to build in carbohydrate here and there, and so almost naturally progressed myself into that periodized carbohydrate approach. But what's very easy when you're 22 years old with no life responsibilities is very different when you're 30 years old with a kid, a wife, a life, all these kind of things. And the sort of the more conversations I had as part of my PhD research with ketogenic athletes, the more I saw that actually, I think this might be an issue in a way with social media, is that what you hear on social media and those sort of extremes actually aren't replicated in the real world. And actually, I got out into the real world, I spoke to ketogenic athletes, and what I was expecting was a sort of the dogmatic, I avoid carbohydrate, I don't touch them, etc., etc. What I got was the opposite. What I got was, I avoid carbohydrate. I've made it part of my lifestyle, and kind of here's how. And that how was often not worrying at, if we're going to get a takeaway once a month with the kids, I'm not going to say no to a takeaway. I'm not going to be that awkward person on the phone that says, do you add sugar to your sauce, or all these kind of things. And really, I think there's a brilliant paper by the group at Liverpool, John Moores, who do a lot of work within sports nutrition, which is all about fueling the work required. And I think you take a lot from that, in the sense that I think for a long time in research, you had almost like a sort of diet wars. It was keto versus carbohydrate.
Correct.
And actually, and that still happens to this day to an extent.
I see that in my comments all the time.
Yeah, and me too, to be honest. It's all, and it's very easy to get pigeonholed, and I was definitely sort of guilty of this when I first started sort of publicly talking about the work I did, and you get put into, this is the keto guy. But actually, I think adding in that level of individuals, I sort of speak to a lot of people that are actually, that are athletes that run, and sort of, it's never as simple as drop your carbohydrate. It's very rarely that simple, actually. And so it's where, firstly, I think there's not a good body of evidence to suggest that everyone needs to stop eating carbohydrate, and in every exercise modality you'll get faster. But I think there's also a case to be made that, especially now we're seeing this sort of huge rise in carbohydrate obsessions, 120 grams an hour, and there's still not a single published paper that shows 120 grams an hour is going to make you faster. And so
exactly,
you see these extremes, and I think again, it's the boring academic in me always comes back to what's the evidence and what do we actually have, and often that does end up somewhere in the middle, and that's quite boring sometimes. And it's not often a view that that it's going to get me 3 million views on TikTok if I wanted it. But actually, I think particularly the more I talk to runners and people in the real world, it's a view that, particularly because we're so distorted by social media, I think that is quite refreshing. Is that actually it isn't simple. I haven't been lied to all my life on this side or on this side, and I guess that's where the level of sort of personalization of things is really important, because there's many ways to achieve the same result, and the vast majority of people running, they run because they love running, they like competing, but it isn't their life. You have a job, you have a family, you have all these other things, whatever it might be, and it's about fitting it around that. And I think actually, as someone who does really see the benefits of fat oxidation and dropping carbohydrate in some contexts, sometimes the dogmatic sort of preaching of we must all be ketogenic actually puts more people off, I think, than it brings to the idea of, how about you drop carbohydrates in a meal? How about you have a fasted session in the week? Which is kind of a way to achieve some of the results without saying to someone, right, this is what you did eat, this is what you now will eat, go. I don't think that's a particularly effective way of inducing behavior change. I guess that's
right. It's still a spectrum.
Exactly. Yeah.
Matt, my final question for you is, what does endurance mean to you?
Oh, wow. What a lovely question that is. I guess speaking from a purely personal perspective, I was almost going to be boring and just give you like a scientific definition. But for me, endurance is about being able to do something for a prolonged time. And I guess as someone who is a bad runner, but a loving runner, I love to run. When I think of endurance, I think of being able to go out and think and take my mind off whatever stresses I might have, and just be able to run and think about nothing, put on a podcast, put on some music, and just sort of be free. And the more ultra runners I talk to, and this is why I love the ultra running community, because that's where you really see the love for exercise, I think, and that I go out because I love it, and because I can go and I can run around my trail, and it takes your mind off things. And so I think for me, endurance is just that ability to go out and do something and to use your body and to show your body what it's capable of doing. Adapting to training, I'm sort of about 6 weeks into a training block right now, having taken quite a long time sort of off running and strength training. And so over the last 6 weeks, I've seen my resting heart rate drop from 62 to about 49. And
Wow.
so that, like, just the sort of the power of endurance of that, like, consistent training, and the sort of the benefits you feel physiologically, the benefits you feel mentally. Suddenly I'm sleeping well. So to me, endurance is almost that, like, the freedom and the mental game of being able to get out and just be free. And that's where freedom, again, from things like fasted training is quite an interesting avenue. But I digress. I've spoken enough about fasted training today.
Matt, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that conversation. It was an absolute pleasure.